So welcome back to our second episode this week. If you're just now tuning in, this week, in honor of Brain Awareness Week, hosted by the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, we are releasing an episode each day with a guest.
We will be interviewing someone on a specific topic within neuroscience. On our second episode, we have Dr. Bruce MacLennan with us today.
All right, so Dr. MacLennan, if you could just go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us what you do here at UT, and what is your teaching or research area that you're interested in?
Sure. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and I teach a number of courses in computing, mostly senior level, graduate level courses. Most relevant to this podcast, I teach a course in computational cognitive neuroscience. I also teach a course in bio-inspired computation, and a course in machine learning, and a course in unconventional computation. So new ways of doing computing with quantum computing, for example, and molecular computing and stuff like that. And that pretty much is my research area as well. I work on artificial intelligence and some swarm robotics, and that's where I apply my interest in neuroscience as well.
Awesome. So could you just go ahead and tell us a little bit about what exactly is computational neuroscience?
Well, computational neuroscience in the broad sense is applying computer techniques to neuroscience problems. And that can be done in many different ways. So, for example, in neuroscience, you get a lot of imaging data, for example, and that data has to be processed. You want to perhaps enhance the image or look for particular patterns in the image. Perhaps, and this is where machine learning can come in, train a AI system to recognize particular kinds of patterns. One example, for example, is you might take very fine slices of brain tissue and try and trace out all of the connections between the neurons. And so you've got a little circle on one slice that is perhaps an axon from a neuron, and you have to match that up with another little circle on the next slice, which is part of the same axon. Mm-hmm. And so you can write programs to do this in the try and find these connections in the most likely way. So that's one thing. One of the things I'm interested in especially is modeling different aspects of the brain. So if we think we understand what processes are going on in some particular region of the brain, we can write computer programs that do just similar things. And then, for example, if there may be clinical information that says that, if there's a lesion in this particular part of the brain, a patient will suffer some sort of deficit. Well, we can do the same thing in the computer program. We can make an artificial lesion in the computer program and see if it produces a similar kind of behavior. If it does, then that's some evidence that that's in fact a good hypothesis about what's going on in the brain. If it doesn't, well, then we have to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
So we can model particular cognitive processes, for example, and in this way, often without either having to do invasive experiments on animal models or without having to wait for a patient with the right type of lesion or lesion in the right location, for example, we can do experiments in the computer instead and test out hypotheses that way.
Wow. So in computational neuroscience, is it more about manipulating a program or building a program from the ground up from scratch?
Well, I would say it's both. So because there's a lot of work in computational neuroscience, there's a lot of programs already out there. And so I would recommend to anybody, don't reinvent the wheel. If there's a program already out there that's appropriate, you should either try using it or perhaps starting with it, modify it in some way. So these are mostly research tools produced by in other universities or other research places, and so usually you can get the software for free, and usually somebody is going to be very happy if you're using their software and extending it to do something else. Mm-hmm. But it may be that you're working on a problem where nobody has written the software to do it, and in that case you would probably be collaborating, as a neuroscientist, you would be collaborating with computer scientists to create a new program. And something maybe I should mention is that we use these computational models at many different levels. So, for example, there are programs that model individual neurons and basically break the neuron up into very tiny pieces. And so they're very detailed mathematical models of what's going on in the neuron. And so if you're interested in those very low-level sorts of questions, you might use a model like that. But because they're so detailed, they take a lot of computer time, and it's difficult to model very many neurons. If you're not interested in the low-level stuff that's going on, you would use a higher-level model that uses simpler models of the neurons, but because of that, it can model many more neurons, thousands or tens of thousands or more. And so you can have models at many different levels. And so you have to, as is generally the case in science, you have to pick models that are at the appropriate level for the question you're trying to ask. Now, one of the problems in neuroscience is there are so many levels, and they're not totally independent of each other. So it can be a difficult scientific problem to figure out exactly what level you should be at and how much of the adjacent levels you have to include.
Very true.
Yeah. So you mentioned that just like having a computational component to almost like any field is pretty important. So how would the importance of having a computational scientist be different in something like biology-based, like neuroscience, versus something like physics or just pure math?
Well, I would say one of the principal difficulties, and some physicists would probably argue with this, is that biology is much harder. It's more complicated. In many cases in physics, you're dealing with systems. Well, first of all, they're not living, and in many cases, the materials are physically simpler. So part of the problem in neuroscience is, first of all, you're dealing with living things. You're dealing with complicated molecules, proteins, neurotransmitters, things like that. And a lot of what's important about neuroscience doesn't come from just one neuron. Nevertheless, one neuron's incredibly complicated, but in terms of intelligence, one neuron doesn't give you very much. So the problem is that you've got something that's complicated to begin with, and you've got to have lots of them to really be able to get at the problems of interest, cognition, for example. And then, of course, is the fact that you're dealing with a brain in an organism that's behaving in an environment. And so in many cases, the questions you're interested in have to do with the relation of the organism to its environment. So you can't sort of just say, oh, well, we don't care about the environment. We'll just sort of think of a brain isolated from its environment, because you may be leaving out a lot of important stuff. So it is this problem that you have things from very complicated physical systems, like complicated molecules, through the cellular level, which is incredibly complicated, and then on up to the level of whole brains, and then even the organism. And you could even, social interactions too are important. And so I would say that's part of what makes it difficult, is that the other sciences are usually just dealing with one small area. And in some sense, neuroscience does really span all of these levels of complexity. And, in many cases, you can restrict it in some way, but you can't just assume that.
So I know before we sat down to do the podcast, I kind of voiced my concerns that maybe AI was going to take over the world, robots were going to come take over, and humans would be obsolete. And you assured me that is not going to happen. And I just wondered if you could speak on that.
Yeah, sure. I won't ensure you it will never happen. but I will say with some confidence that it's not going to happen anytime soon. And the reason is really there is just so much we don't understand about the brain. And when you look at the accomplishments of AI so far, and really there's been some remarkable advances in the last decade, they're all on still very narrow kinds of activities. And so I think that we're very far away from making an artificial intelligence that I would say is capable of powering a robot that has the intelligence of say a mammal, a small mammal, probably even a reptile, and I can talk a little bit about why I think that is. So now that said, though, my caution is that we may be just one breakthrough away from understanding the brain well enough that somebody could come out tomorrow with a theory that says, well, look, really this explains what's going on in all of these different regions of the brain. And then somebody like me can say, thank you very much. I'm going to go now and implement this in some electronics.
Right.
and we could have something, but I don't. But it's a breakthrough, and breakthroughs are unpredictable. So it could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 50 years from now. I don't think it's going to be 50 years from now, but I don't think it's going to be tomorrow either. So that's why I say I'm not too worried about AI taking over the world, anytime soon. We just don't understand enough. One of the things that I've done some research on is how to get a robot to reach and grasp an object, which would seem like such a simple thing. We do it all the time. We don't think about it. We do it competently most of the time. We don't drop what we picked up, but the amount of sensory motor coordination to do that is enormous. And it's something that robots still cannot do very well. There's more progress being made on it, largely using neural net techniques, which are based on the brain, but we still do not have the theory really that tells us how to make a robot competently reach and grasp and pick up an object. Or any other thing of comparable complexity. So, we're talking about things that these aren't, advanced skills of human beings. These are things that any normal human can do and lots of mammals can do as well. So I spend time sometimes just watching my dog hold a toy and chew on it, and figuring how is this working, and I think we don't have very good theories about how the brain controls the body, for example. And talking about complexity, what we do, I think, understand much better now, and this again is part of the advancements of the last decade or so, is the role of the body as a foundation for intelligent behavior. And so, again, a lot of the AI systems now, they don't really have bodies of any significance. And needing to be able to coordinate a physical body in a real physical world, not in some sort of idealized situation, and not in a simulated world, is something that, again, any animal can do. And it's a primary purpose of the nervous system, and we don't do very well with our AI systems. And you might say, well, who cares about that? Maybe we don't want an AI system to do that. But I think we understand much better now that the mechanisms that are used for controlling the body are the foundation on which higher order things are built. And that was one of the mistakes of older approaches to AI. They thought they could have just sort of a floating intellect without the embodied part. And we understand better now why that doesn't work. Partly from trying it. But I think we also understand how that embodied intelligence is a foundation for what we think of as the higher cognitive activities.
So how did you get involved in, all of this about neural networks and just like combining two seemingly different fields into something that just like works so harmoniously together? Well,
I was thinking back on that, and sometimes you when you reach my age anyway, you start thinking, how did I ever get here anyway? And, there used to be, when I was growing up, what's generally considered a very bad analogy of talking about computers as giant brains, And I think perhaps that idea was somewhere in the back of my head, because one of the first computer programs I wrote as an undergraduate was a neural net program, an attempt to model some simple neural networks and get them to do something. It never worked, but it was actually the 7th program I remember that I worked on, and so it was very early in my computing career. But I got my undergraduate degree in mathematics because there were no computer science, or very few computer science degree programs at the time, and that was kind of the closest thing. And then I went to graduate school where I did get computer science, MS and PhD. And but I was working on different aspects of computer science at that time, programming language design and other stuff like that. But in the mid-1980s, I was thinking about artificial intelligence and about why the techniques that were used in artificial intelligence at that time were not working. And so basically I asked myself the question, well, what would make AI work? And I didn't know, but I knew the brain was intelligent.
Yeah.
So I said, well, obviously we should look at the brain. And I wasn't the only one thinking that in the mid-1980s. Now, people had thought that same idea decades before and had given up on it. But in the mid-80s, people were starting to think about the brain again and saying, well, look, this AI stuff is not working right. It's not working. And maybe we ought to look at the brain, And so a bunch of us started doing that and started doing things like learning about neuroscience and taking our mostly kind of naive ideas about neuroscience that we had learned, long before, and saying, well, what are neuroscientists doing now? And that's really has been the process I've been in for the last 30 plus years. So I've been trying to keep abreast with all of the developments in neuroscience, mostly because they're really interesting, but also because I can then sort of mine neuroscience for ideas that then I can apply in my computer science work. And this, as I mentioned, I teach a course on bio-inspired computing, and that's sort of the same idea, but applied more broadly. Look at things that nature does well, try and understand how it works, and then apply those same ideas in computer science. So that's why I work on things like swarm robotics. Study the way ants behave, study the way termites behave, learn from that, and then apply it to controlling robots. Lots of little robots.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
So that's really kind of the, sort of the, like I said, the story of the last 30 years of my life is working, hanging out a lot with neuroscientists and biologists, and reading that literature, and then trying to apply those ideas. And I think also, the information goes in the other direction as well, because when things work in AI, or when they don't work in AI, that often is information for neuroscientists, that it's like, well, you had this theory, we've tried it really doesn't work very well, but if you tweak it in this way, it works very well, maybe you should look and see if that's going on in the brain, because again, we can test things much more easily with computers than you can with real brains, and so it provides a good test bed for many neuroscience ideas. So now we've had, in the last decade, we have another resurgence of interest in these sort of neural network based approaches to AI, which is very exciting to me, because it's kind of like what I've been hoping would happen for a long time is now actually happening. For years we were saying, well, this ought to work really well, but we didn't have the computer power to really test it. Now people are showing it really works well.
Yeah.
So that's very exciting. And I think there's going to be a lot of more progress. But we can't be overawed at what we've accomplished so far, because when you look under the surface a little bit, you see there's some real limitations. And this is why I'm telling my students we've got to keep going back to the brain. And every time, when we look at an AI system that may be doing something very exciting looking, and you look at it more closely and say, well, it's really got some significant limitations. It can be fooled, for example, and I tell my students, okay, why aren't animals fooled in the same way? We need to understand what's going on in the animal's brain, so to understand why animals are not fooled in this way, so we can maybe take those same ideas and use them to improve our AI systems. So that's part of my research program, and what I encourage my students to do is keep going back to the brain. One problem with engineers is they'll take a good idea from something like neuroscience and say, okay, I know it now. I never really liked that biology stuff anyway, so I'll just go and take this one idea and use it, and then never go back and see what's been done in the last 10 years in biology. And so I try and guard against that tendency. We especially those of us that are sort of more mathematically oriented, we like things nice and neat, but so we are kind of sometimes scared off by the complexity of biology.
Well, it makes me feel kind of better that someone who's not immediately in the biology field actually thinks highly of biology.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I've definitely heard just people think that it's only math and physics are the ruling sciences, and it's just I do respect both of those fields a lot, but it's just biology's got some good stuff too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's a real difficult thing to try and avoid. On the one hand, taking biology and shoehorning it into our mathematical models, which makes them very neat, but
but not really true to their own form.
But not true to their own form. And you see, this is part of what happened in AI, and part of why in the mid-'80s people were saying this isn't working, is they took some very simple models of cognition. They basically said that thinking is just a process of reasoning. It was very neat mathematically, it was all logical, it was the sort of thing computers did very well, and people said, oh, well, this is just what's going on in people's heads. We don't need to know about all that messy brain stuff, because they said basically, the brain is equivalent to a computer, but it's a lot messier, so we'll just work on computers. And they didn't understand that messiness is part of what gives brains and human cognition flexibility. It's sort of that slippery, not quite firm stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the material, but I'm talking about the processing that gives us flexibility in our behavior, and made computers, when they tried to do computer reasoning and robotics and things like that, very rigid and inflexible. And if you've ever worked with a computer, and you all have, you get one character wrong and it's wrong. It's very inflexible. And that's the way AI systems were. They were brittle. Something's not quite right, they're stupid. They just make a stupid response. And part of it was, taking preconceived ideas about what was going on in human cognition, and then trying to do AI on that basis. So I think that messiness, that makes it complicated, makes it not so neat, is also part of the strength of biological intelligence. And that's also, we have to kind of go against our tendencies, those of us that like the neat mathematics.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah. So for anyone who, because you talked about it from the computer science to kind of understand how the brain sort of works, how would you, what kind of advice would you give to someone much like ourselves who are neuroscience students but don't really have a lot of background in computer science but would like to get involved in the field of computational neuroscience?
Well, what I would suggest, of course, ideally would be to do something like double major.
Oh, yeah. It's a little too late to do that for both of us.
you know, or to get like a minor in computer science. Beyond that, what I would suggest is to try and get some computer science training. You know, it's useful to be able to take your data and know what tools are available. There's a lot of tools that are available for free now, software packages for machine learning, for data analysis and things like that. And so you really need to learn to use those tools. Now, it's not necessary, you know, if you're like going into a research position, you've got your PhD in neuroscience, you're probably collaborating with somebody else, maybe they have a PhD in computer science, and so you can work with people that have the expertise because you're probably going to be on a team. But even so, it's useful if you understand what they're doing,
Right.
you know. And so I would say to look for short courses or even just online learning, you know, various sorts of free online courses, MOOCs and things like that, that you can learn a little bit about these techniques. So there's, you know, there's some programming languages that are relatively easy to learn. For R is one of them, Python is another one, and they have a lot of packages that go with them. So you can learn sort of the basic ideas of programming and then use these packages. And that will also then help you to learn some of these computational tools we talked about. For instance, simulators of different parts of the brain or different neural systems at various sorts of levels. And then if you're going into neuroscience research, you know, you may be dealing with vast amounts of data and using supercomputers to analyze it. And in that case, you're probably going to be working with somebody that's a specialist in that area. So they're going to be the ones with sort of the hardcore programming skills that can use multi-processor supercomputers and stuff like that to really grind through a lot of data. But again, it's useful if you have some understanding of the computational techniques, so you know you can understand what they're doing.
Right.
You know, and it's just like with anything else, with any tool, it's useful to have a little knowledge of how it works, right? So you can use it well. So that's what I would say, I guess, is you know, if in your undergraduate program you can fit in a little bit of computer science education, that would be a good thing. But there's lots of other opportunities as well. And I think, you know, in any of the sciences now, but certainly neuroscience, computational skills are important. And I mean, if you look at, you know, what many graduate programs in computer science are suggesting, there's a computational component for that, both for modeling and for data analysis of various sorts. So yeah, computing is in your future whether you like it or not.
No, I'm definitely regretting not picking up that double major in computer science.
Oh, for sure.
Yep. All right. So that concludes our second episode for the Brain Awareness Campaign, and a big thank you to Dr. Bruce MacLennan for coming and talking about this fascinating topic with us about computational neuroscience.
If you're interested in learning more about the Brain Awareness Campaign, be sure to visit the Brain Awareness website, which is brainawareness.utk.edu, for all the details. And thank you for tuning in.
We did it.
Ah, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for just like being super flexible, because